Okay, in this example, what I want to do is start working with path parameters. And I had a note here about JSON. I need to get rid of that. I moved that to the next lesson because I was making this one overly complicated for what I want to show. All I want to do is show the static routes like this one right here, and then show routes with path parameters like this one right here. So you can see the static route just responds to the hello URI right there, or the hello path. This one is hello and then slash, and this part here is going to be a variable. So that's all I'm trying to show is what are called path parameters. You can also call it a variable. And I just want to show how to handle that. So I have one example here, and then I'll have another example here. And I think I'm going to create one more also because I want to show multiple parameters in a row. So that's the purpose of this particular lesson, is to show these routes just like that. The other thing I have to do now is start using SBT because it's going to make our life much simpler. And what I mean by that is we come over here. What you could do with SBT in this build file like this one right here is fork the ZIO HTTP process off like this. For example, if I was using Scala CLI over here, I'd have to run the example. Then when I was finished running it, I'd hit Control C to stop it. Then that might hang up, or we might have some port problems or something like that. And I found instead of using Scala CLI at this point, it's just much easier to start using SBT. And an important part about that formula, and the reason I'm showing this, is you'll really want this part right here where you fork the running ZIO HTTP process off into its own thread over here. And that way when we hit Control C, it goes away much more easily. If you don't have this, then SBT will hang up just the same way that Scala CLI was hanging up. So this line right there, line number 6, is very important part of this recipe. Everything else is pretty normal SBT build stuff. These are all the dependencies I'm using, not just in this example. The only thing I'm really using in this example is ZIO and ZIO HTTP. In the other examples, I'll be using some of these other libraries. And then this shows that the main class that I want to work with for this video is this one right here. So Alvin 103 and then path params. So when I come over here, you can see the package is Alvin 103 up here, and then the object name is path params right there. So that's what we're going to be running in this video. Okay, so given that background, we have things that are very similar to the previous example. We have an object. This one's named path params that extends ZIO app default. If we slide down to the run value, the typical ZIO run value down here, you can see I'm starting the ZIO HTTP server right here. You see that's ZIO.http, and the object is server. And we say we want to serve our application. So the application is going to be these routes like I had in the previous video. And then down here, we need to provide the server configuration, which is this one right there. I'll come back to that in just a moment. And then the server.live variable as well. And I believe I covered all of that in the previous video. The thing I want to note here is the server configuration. I'm using the default configuration, and then I'm saying with the default, I want to use port 8080. That is the default, but I just wanted to show you how to configure this. Keep alive is true, idle timeout is 30. I think all these values are actually the defaults, but I just wanted to show how you can configure these. And I showed this default configuration in the previous video as well, so I don't want to belabor that either. So now you've seen the run value, and you've seen that we're serving up our application right here. So we'll come back to the app right here. So the app value right here is just a collection of routes. Instead of having every route declared as a separate variable, in this case, I'm just putting all of my routes inside of this routes constructor right here. And I'm only doing that because that's just a little bit easier to look at. Normally you would have code and it would be like route 1 equals ... route 2 equals ... and so on. But this is a little bit easier for what we're doing right here. So let me save that. Again, the first route is going to be a get request on /hello. When we get that, we're going to have this handler. There's actually easier ways to write this, and I have a note over here. So if you wanted to write this route right here in a more simple fashion, you would write it like this. I can't remember if I showed that in a previous video, so I wanted to make sure I show it right now. So let me delete that, because there is a reason I'm doing this code right here. So I want to start showing how to use a handler, and specifically I want to show that when you create a handler, you have access to the request variable like this. And I mention that because I'm not using it in this example. So what you could do here, and probably should do here, is leave that like that. and that indicates to the rest of the world, I'm not using this, and I intended not to use it. So I'll go ahead and leave that just like that and save that. So that's the first one. And again, the reason I'm starting to show that is because when you get into dynamic path parameters like this one here, this one is saying, I want to have a path that begins with /hello, like I show right here. And then after the next slash, I want to take a string parameter named name right here. So that would be like /hello/Alvin, like I show up here. And what happens with the handler over here is that now these parameters that you string together over here are going to start coming into your function over here. And I need to be clear that there's no connection actually between the word name and the variable name right here. I could call this foo, and all that code would still work fine. But it's better to leave this name being meaningful. One reason is for documentation. I think it also shows up in error messages. We can take a look at that. It also makes code more maintainable for other developers. And it might be helpful in route matching issues. I can't remember, but I think that's true as well. So as a general rule, I recommend using the same name here and here, but you do not have to. Getting back to my main point, anytime you use a variable in the path parameter over here, and here I'm declaring that this variable is a string with this function right there, anytime you use that variable over there, you're going to have a new parameter over here. So that's why I was showing this request over here, and now I'm showing the parameter over here. And just like this one is a string, I'm declaring in this next example that this one is an integer. So here I'm calling it ID, and then I have ID, which is an int right there, and then I'll echo out that value right there. And then once we get through all this stuff, then I'll add one more route down there where we take in multiple parameters. And I don't have that one shown in the documentation, but we will take care of that in just a few moments. So let's go ahead and save that. Keep everything in view, and then come over here and run this. Okay, you can see that it's running Alvin 103 path params, and it has forked that. And again, the reason I did that is so I can hit Control-C here, and you can see it stops right away, and then SBT is still fine. Everything works fine over here. If you don't fork that, you're going to have kind of a mess over here. So I really, really recommend forking your process as I showed right here in the build.sbt file right there. Makes your life much, much easier. Okay, so this is up and running, and what we can do now is call any of these paths over here. And if you'll ignore this first line over here, what I found was I was going to show version 104 in this video, and I was showing path parameters in JSON at the same time, and I started to realize I was making that more confusing than it had to be, so I got rid of that, and I created 103 over here. That's the reason that was there. So we can test these paths now, so I will curl that first one. This is the static path right here. And I did not copy everything, apparently. There we go. So that's our static path number one. Then the next one is going to be hello, whatever your username is. So that's going to be calling this one right here. And now if I say Alvin, then we'll get that. Let's see what happens. I don't know if I can mess up a string, can I? All right, because it'll just do that. Let's try messing up the integer next. Let's do that one. So then I want to try the third one, and this is going to be users and then the ID, which is declared as an integer right there. So there's that one and that one. And what happens now if I say Fred? Okay, I apologize. I had to leave for a little while. I am back here, and I was looking at how to debug this problem, I think. So let us go ahead and start that code again. So let's run that. And what I believe I was showing was something like that. So if I call that with a number, like 101, I actually added the -I parameter in here, but I think I cut that off in the video. So let me get that out of there. Actually, let's clear this and get rid of that -I for now. So that's what I was showing. And then I was showing that this failed, that we don't get any output here. And I think I described that as a failure over here. And actually what it is a pattern matching issue, right? Because I'm saying that I expect an integer over here, and now you're giving me a string. So what's happening is I just don't have a pattern over here to match that case. So you could have a pattern over here if you wanted to. And we should see that when I add the -I or the -V option. So that's why I was starting to take a look at that. And there we go. So that's a 404 not found. So what happened in the video was I got a phone call, and during the phone call I was starting to debug this issue a little bit, and I started to write error handling code inside of here while I was on that call, and then I realized, oh, this isn't a error inside of here, it's a pattern matching error. The error, or I should say the pattern matching error, was over here. I'm saying I want an int, and over here I'm trying to pass in a string, so that's why I get a 404 not found. So if you wanted to handle this situation over here, I can't think of why you would actually, but what you could do is just copy that and paste that, make that a string, and make this a string, and so on. And then you could put something like a bad ID right there, and then for that I would add a status, and then I would say status, and that is a good suggestion. I would call that a bad request, like that. So if you wanted to have some error handling code, that's something that you could do. So let me save that, kill that, and restart it. And then go ahead and run that one. So then you'll see the 400 bad request right there, and then bad ID Fred, like that. Off the top of my head, I can't think of why you would want to handle this. But again, the part for me was I started to write some error handling code inside of here, and during that phone call I was like, oh yeah, this isn't really an error inside of this code right here, it's just a pattern match over here on the left side. That's all I was running into over here. Okay, and then the last thing I'm going to do over here is I mentioned I want to show how to take multiple parameters over here in our URI or in our path. So what I'm doing here is saying, well, what if we had a GET request for a catalog? That's a static value right there. And right after catalog, it would show the category, then the subcategory, and then we might get the page, like if we were doing some pagination. And then also a limit. So I'm showing, what is that, 4 parameters? 1, 2, 3, and 4 over here. 2 strings and 2 ints. Then everything else just looks the same. That's a handler. Now what I do is I'm going to have category as a string, subcategory as a string, page, int, limit, int, and then the request. The request always comes last over here. And then I had some code over here, and I want to get rid of that code right there. And we're just going to give this a response and just say something like, hi there, is just fine for our purposes here. So then I will stop that and run that again. And now I can come over here and say I want a catalog, and then I'll say something like shoes, men's, page 1, 10 values per page, right? That's what I have over here, page 1, and the limit there. And I still have that -I, but anyway, we get the 200 okay, and then the high there. So I just wanted to show that. And again, if you put something else in over here, that is just going to be a pattern matching issue right there. So we get a 404 not found when you replace 10 with foo. All right, so I think that's everything I wanted to show you. I showed again how to work with a static route like this one right here. And then everything else I did was showing how to work with dynamic path parameters. So that's what we did in these next 3 examples here. So when you want to start passing in parameters like these over here, I hope these examples over here are helpful for you.